this month of February, we're starting a new series, and our series is called Relationships That Matter, and we're going to be looking at the different types of relationships that we can look at and try to strengthen, because these are the relationships that truly matter in our lives. And we're going to be looking at 4 different relationships that we're going to be talking about throughout the month of February. And firstly, the relationship we have with the Father in heaven. And next week, the Lord willing, we're going to be talking about the relationship of family. The following week, the relationship with the church family. Sister Vanjie will be here, and she's going to be sharing on that, on the life group and the church family. On the final Sunday of February, we're going to be talking about our relationship towards the community. So we're going to be talking about our vertical relationship, which is the foundation of all other relationships. It is the most important of all relationships, in that this vertical relationship is what upholds all of our horizontal relationships, and we can never get that wrong. The way that we see the horizontal relationships with family and with church and with the community is going to be dependent on how we see and how strong our relationship is vertically with our Heavenly Father. And so we're going to be looking at that, and I'm going to be talking through it today in Matthew chapter 22, and just sharing some stories with us. And my hope today is that our hearts would be stirred up within inside of us to be more intentional, to be more invested, and to do something more than what we have already been doing in terms of strengthening and cultivating our relationship with our Heavenly Father. So Matthew 22, verse 34 to 40, reading from the NIV, it says, "Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: 'Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?' Jesus replied, 'Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself.'" And so this is where we get the concept of where our relationships come from. It is our vertical relationship with God, upholding all of our horizontal relationships with family and church and with community. This past 3 weeks during our fast, I don't know about you, but each one of us went into this fast excitedly, I'm sure, and we all had our own unique set of things that we were believing God for, areas that we would have a breakthrough in, and I'm sure we all did. You know, some of us had personal areas that we're believing a breakthrough on, and some of us were believing for maybe career or new jobs or what relationships. For me, there were some personal things I was believing God for, and of course there were ministerial things that I was believing God for, and I was believing God for you and for us as a church family. And we came together every Wednesday for 3 weeks right here, and we prayed together and believed God together. And those are all good. It was great to have those personal items to be praying to God and praying through and believing God for. But each time that I would go through my list of things that I was believing God for in coming to a place of intercession, it was almost as though I was always being brought back to one aspect, to one principle, one item on the agenda that seemed to be more urgent than everything else that I was believing God for, that I was praying for. Not that I was believing God for silly things. I had in my heart believing God for breakthrough for our church and for you individually. So it was serious matters I was believing God for, but yet it always seemed like I was being brought back to this urgency of my heart's alignment with God. It wasn't that God was not interested in all the other things, but it seemed as though he was saying those are important, but there is something that is of greater importance that I want to deal with, that I want you to focus more on, and that is your heart with me. I don't know if that was just an individual thing that he was speaking to me, but maybe there are others of us here in this room or joining us online where it was the Lord bringing me back, bringing us back, bringing me back to a place of alignment in my heart for him. Because we can pray for many different things and legitimate things, but what the Lord is really after is our heart's alignment with him. Where our hearts will burn for him again, where he becomes our overwhelming thought, he becomes and he overtakes our thought patterns, he overtakes our emotions, where he becomes he consumes our very day. I remember, and I've shared this here, and I'm sure you've heard of it before. If you remember back to when you first encountered Jesus, you remember when you first encountered the love of God, and you were so grateful, yes, for the forgiveness of sin, and you were made new, and you felt like a brand new person. But more than all of those things, there was this closeness, a longing for more of God. See, that is such a typical response when somebody really comes to encounter Jesus, is that they want to just be with him. You remember the demoniac in Gadarenes, and when he was set free, he wanted to go with Jesus. And Jesus says, no, you stay here and you tell the 10 cities and give the testimony of what I have done. There's this desire to be close to Jesus. Not so much for what more he can do, but for who he is. I remember newly being saved, and I didn't know anything else except I knew that Jesus was real and that he loved me. I remember I was always looking forward to the times where everybody would leave the house. And before I encountered Jesus, I was always looking forward to everybody leaving the house. It was all for the wrong reasons. So I could do all the stupid things I wanted to do and not have to hide and all those things. But now, after encountering Jesus, I couldn't wait till everybody would leave the house so I can just have the quietness to just be with him. Even to this day, after having walked with him now almost 25 years, those were my formative moments. Those are my most treasured moments in my Christian memory, is those times that I would just be alone with him. And he would come and he would show up in that room. And we would have fellowship together. I didn't know anything about the Bible yet. I was brand new. But I knew the presence of God and how desperate and how much I longed for that. I remember going Tuesday night revival meetings. Our church back then, the Lord came and visited, and there was revival breaking out, and we would have revival services every Tuesday night. And I remember God would move in such powerful and mighty ways. The heaviness of his abiding presence would descend on us. And we just knew we were in the presence of the Holy One of Israel. Nobody had to tell us this is the presence of God. Nobody had to explain what was going on. We just knew the heaviness of his presence. And we wouldn't care how long it would go. And they went long. We knew what time the revival meeting started, but nobody knew what time it would end. Week after week, God would do amazing things. And we would be there. We would be there early because we want the front row seats. And God would come. We would worship and God would come. And 7 o'clock would turn to 8. 8 would turn to 9. 9 would turn to 10. And even after everybody was dismissed, we would sit around. I remember I would wait till everybody goes home. And I would stay in that sanctuary. There were times I slept in the church. Now, it wasn't allowed, but it was so late. I would stay in that sanctuary, lingering in the presence of God. I would stack the chairs away. I would mop the floor. People would have deliverance and be vomiting, and you'd have to clean all that up. And it was just, the presence of God was there. Going to Thursday night PDTC, it's a discipleship, YWAM discipleship process. So I enrolled, and so it would be Tuesday night revival meetings, Thursday night classes, going from school straight to the seminar, to the training. I didn't mind not having dinner. I was just so hungry for the presence of God. Tuesday night revival, Thursday night trainings. This went on for months. Friday night youth. Those two, you knew what time it started, but you never were sure what time it would end. And there would be times God would just show up and the worship would just keep going. I remember times that we worshiped for 2.5 hours nonstop, because the wave of God's presence would come, and it was like the waves of the sea. It would come so strongly, and then it would ebb, it would flow. It was like this just washing over us. And the worship team, there was no set lineup like we do now. They just would sing spontaneously their songs to the Lord in response to the presence of God. And it was never this. Nobody ever looked at their watch. What time is it? Why are we still worshiping? Can we get on to the next? It was the presence of God would come, and we would just respond in worship and just unrehearsed worship, but yet it was the Holy Spirit orchestrating. He was this maestro who was orchestrating the whole worship team and the congregation, and we would just keep going, and we go in and deeper into the presence of God. And afterwards, we would go across the street and fellowship, and we would go home so late. We just kept talking about Jesus, and Jesus was the all-consuming presence, desire, longing in our hearts. Go home real late on Friday night to be up early Saturday morning to go to worship practice. Now remember, this is in the Philippines where you're stuck in traffic pretty much half of your life. Yet you didn't mind sitting there. You're excited to get to practice because it wasn't just practice. We called it worship practice, but it was really worshiping Jesus. It was like an exclusive meeting where it was just the worship team, but they weren't practicing. We were actually worshiping Jesus. And we would show up even though we knew we were not ministering that Sunday, because we knew God was going to show up. And that worship practice we started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and God knows when it's going to end. Nobody ever cared, because when you're in the presence of God, there's fullness of joy. And so we would go and we would just linger and worship. Saturday morning until probably just after lunch, and then hang out at the center doing Bible studies. Go home to get ready for Sunday morning. Sunday morning would come, and we just end up worshiping Jesus and just loving the presence. God is so faithful. He would show up in such amazing and sweet ways. And after Sunday morning celebration, after Sunday morning service, we would go and find out who else was having a service in the city. Because God was moving, not just in our church, but He was moving in other churches as well. And so we would find out who was having an evening service, and we would all go to that service. It didn't matter if they were the Catholic charismatics. It didn't matter the denomination. As long as God was there, we were going to be there. And I remember we would go, and this whole group of us would just show up, and people would be surprised, like, who are these people? But they didn't mind, because they knew that we were just as hungry as they were. We were there for the presence of God, and there was just this oneness, a unity, rallying around the presence of God, the goodness of the Father. And so we would go, and nothing was ever a sacrifice. Nothing was ever a sacrifice. Sitting in traffic, sitting in the heat, going home late in the floodwaters, in the rain, none of that was a sacrifice. It was all a pleasure. Yeah. wading through the floodwaters of our city, because the smallest amount of rain, there'd be at least half a foot of water, dirty water. And we would wade through that with such joy. Just talking about Jesus. We would be sitting in restaurants unintentionally. We're just talking about what Jesus had just done in the revival service, not knowing there were people. We were oblivious that there were people all around us, and they were listening to our conversation. And we were talking about Jesus, and this young man, if you remember, this young man came and said, "You don't know me, but I've been hearing about you talking about Jesus, and I am so sorry that I've been cussing and swearing, but you don't know, I came here from the U.S., and this girl that I thought was," and he began to open up his life of what he was going through, and we did not even know we were just talking about Jesus, and people were coming into conviction with the words that they were saying. We were not trying to evangelize. We were just talking about Jesus, and wherever two or three are gathered in His name, there He is in the midst of them, and His presence was with us in that restaurant, and He drew people. And we were able to minister to this young man, and with the heartbreak that he was going through, we were just consumed with Jesus. Nothing was ever a chore. Nothing we ever did as volunteers, spending our own money to give out tracts and to go to different churches to invite them to whatever was happening. Nothing was ever a chore. Everything was a joy. It was never a drag. It was always full of excitement. It was always full of life. I remember those days. Those were the days I was reminded of during this fast. And I felt that those were the days that the Father is bringing my heart back to. Your hearts, our hearts, back to. See, sometimes we start there, but we can get so busy with doing things, not bad things. We can get preoccupied with doing the works of the ministry. He's not so much after your works as He is after your heart. Now, it's not that we don't do the works, but He wants to ensure that our hearts are first aligned with the Father. That's the design of God. If you remember back in the Garden of Eden, how the Father would come and fellowship with Adam and Eve. It wasn't that they were being lazy after being commanded to go and multiply and to care and tend over the garden. But there was this desire in the heart of the Father to be with Adam and Eve. The Bible tells us that God came in the cool of the day. And some would say, well, Pastor Knapp, that part is describing after Adam and Eve had fallen, that they heard the sound of God in the garden and they hid because they were ashamed. To which I would say, yes, that may be true, but are you telling me that God would only show up after you sin? Are you telling me that God would only show up after you make a mistake? Notice that He walked in the cool of the day. He wasn't running to punish. he was walking. Why? It leads me to believe that that had been the case. That had been his habit, to come and fellowship with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day, late in the afternoon. He would fellowship with them, to be with them. Maybe ask them, how was your day? We see this relationship with Enoch, who walked with God for 365 years in close fellowship with God. And the word walked, Enoch walked with God. The word walked was not a one-time decision. It was this, it's a description of this back and forth. That he didn't just walk with God and stopped and God kept walking. It's a picture of him walking to one place, this pacing back and forth. Enoch walked with God. We see Abraham walking with God. Walked with God. We see in Exodus 33, Moses walked with God. And the Bible tells us that God spoke to him face to face as one who speaks to a friend. We see David as one who was a man who longed after God. He describes his longing in Psalm 63. He says, "O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you in this parched and weary land where there is no water. I have seen you in your sanctuary and gazed upon your power and glory. Your unfailing love is better than life itself. How I praise you. I will praise you as long as I live, lifting up my hands to you in prayer. You satisfy me more than the richest feast. I will praise you with songs of joy. I lie awake thinking of you, meditating on you through the night." I lie awake thinking of you. That is the heart and the sound of a man who longed for God. Now, was God making it hard on him? Was he playing hard to get? Was he playing hide and seek? No. David already encountered him in his sanctuary. David already saw a glimpse of him. And in his glimpse of him, it just caused a greater hunger for more of him. And see, that's the nature of our God. The more you see him, the more you desire him, the more you encounter him, the more you want to encounter with him. It's not this idea where you have an encounter with him and you're satisfied and you can go a whole week long without getting back to that place of encounter. The more you encounter, the more you want to stay. The more you see him, the more you want to be with him. And that's why Joshua, the son of Nun, went with Moses to the tent of meeting. And after the meeting, Moses would leave the tent, but Joshua stayed in the tent of meeting. What was Joshua doing? I don't know. We're not told what he was doing. But one thing I do know is he was beholding the glory of God. He was waiting on him. He was fellowshipping with God. Yes, we know he became the commander and he took over for Moses. But I believe that it's what was more important than the position was the possession of the presence of God. You see Peter say, "Where shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." Friends, Christianity is not so much about following rules as it is about walking in love with a person. Now, we do follow and obey the teachings of God, but not to get credit, but because of love. In the book of Revelations, as Jesus was addressing the 7 churches of Asia, the very first church that was addressed was the church in Ephesus. The church was great. They were very impactful. They were very fruitful. They were doing great work. They were persevering. They were being persecuted, yet they persevered. Their doctrine was in place. They had the great gift of discernment where they were able to identify true apostles versus the false apostles. And they had all the stuff going with them. But yet the first thing that the Lord addressed was the issue of the loss of their love for Him. The very first thing that was addressed in the 7 churches was not the issue of doctrine, was not the issue of compromise. The very first thing that Jesus addressed in the 7 churches, the first church that he addressed, was the issue of the loss of first love. Friends, where are we today in our love for God? Do we still ache and do we still long for those days of just no fanfare, nobody looking, just me and you? Me and you, and not my prayer requests. Just me and you, and not my prayer list, not what I'm believing you for, what I'm asking you for, what I need you to do for me. Just me and you for you. We are to grow in our love for God. And he says we're to love the Lord with all of our heart. Heart speaks of our affection, our emotion. He's saying to take our affections and direct it towards him. Love is a choice. We choose to take our affection and we turn it towards him. We take our affection and we place it toward him. In the morning, where you just shut everything else off, all the things that needs to be done. And I'm one who has a to-do list that is never ending. It seems like an everlasting to-do list. And it's jumping at me of what I need to do that day. People I need to call, people I need to meet with. All of those things begin to bombard my mind, and I have to fight through all of that mess and all of those things to do to get to the place where it's just me and Jesus for who he is. We have to fight through all of those things that needs to be done, the laundry, the breakfast, the packing lunches and appointments, all of those. We have to fight through all of that so we can still ourselves and quiet ourselves long enough that we can give our full affection to him. That's why in the book of Hebrews it says that you shall labor to enter into his rest. There's a place that we have to fight through so that we can enter into the very presence of God and our hearts become aligned with his heart. Where it's no longer about what he can do and what he can give me, but for who he is. It is cultivating a tender heart so we can not only feel the love of God, but to be able to respond to it with love and joy and gratitude and worship. That our hearts would long after him, like the psalmist says in Psalms 42, as the deer longs for streams of water, so I long for you, O God. I thirst for God, the living God. Family, where are we? How are we? This is not me talking down to you. I am in this process right now where God is wrestling for my heart. God is calling for my heart, not for my deeds, but for my heart. Where are we in our heart for him? Secondly, he says our soul is the seat of our will, our decision-making process. That we are to love him with all of our souls. That we are to seek him, seek the kingdom above all else, and live righteously, and he will give you everything you need. It means that we love God with our priorities. We love God with our calendars, with our schedules. You know, for us, when we look at as a church, when the leadership council comes together at the fall, we look at the church and we plot. We seek the Lord in the direction he wants for us. And according to that, we come up with activities, with things that will facilitate where we believe the Lord is leading us. And we plot those things in the calendar. What is in our calendar, when you look at the calendar, it should tell you what is your priority. When you look at the church calendar, when you look at a calendar, it will tell you, based on the activities and things that are on that calendar, of what are the priorities of that organization. We have a church calendar, but in our own personal calendars, do we make room for God? Times to be set aside times where we could just be with Him. To love the Lord with our soul, our decision-making process, to love Him with not just our affection, but to love Him practically by setting aside time. And then he says to love Him with all of our mind, our intellect. Do we submit ourselves, our truths, to His truth? To submit our opinion to His truth. To let His truth override our opinions. To love His word, to love His truth more than our feelings. To love His word over our opinions. To love Him and to grow in love with Him. How do we grow in our love for God? Number one, be intentional. Just some very practical things that I want to share with you today. How do we grow in our love for God? Be intentional. It's not going to happen automatically. We may have an experience that will initiate it, but it requires intentionality to sustain it. Even for those of us that are married, something happened in the beginning that initiated that relationship. And we call that we fell in love. But how many of us know that the longer we go, we cannot just rely on the feelings itself that initiated. If we want our marriages to stay strong, we have to be intentional in doing things so that we would be able to sustain that relationship, to sustain that marriage. In the same way, God will do things that will draw our hearts. God will do things that will cause our hearts to be lit aflame, but there is a partnership with Him that we have to be intentional about so that we will be able to sustain the relationship. In Leviticus chapter 6, God was telling Moses He was giving him instructions on how the priests are supposed to function. And He tells them in Leviticus chapter 6 that the priests are supposed to come every morning and clear off the ashes from the altar. That there's to be an altar, there's to be wood, there's to be a sacrifice, and the fire is to be going on all night. And every morning, the priest's role is to come in and sweep away the ashes, because it's the ashes that rob the oxygen, that rob the fire with oxygen. And so you're supposed to clear off all the ashes and replenish wood and sacrifice. And the Bible tells us that God instructed Moses that the fire must never go down. It must never die. That there's supposed to be this fire that is ongoing. The fire represents the presence of God. In Leviticus chapter 9, we are shown how that fire was initiated. That fire was not initiated by Moses or the other priests. That the fire actually came down from God and consumed the sacrifice and initiated and kindled the fire. The fire was kindled by God, but it was the responsibility of the priest to make sure that the ashes are taken out, that fresh wood is there, that fresh sacrifice is there, and they're to do that day after day after day so that the fire is sustained. In the same way, you and I are the priesthood of God. We are the priests of our own lives, our own spiritual lives. It's not the pastor, it's not your life group leader, it's not the ministry that you're watching on YouTube. You are the priest of your own spiritual life, and you are called to make sure that you are doing the things that is required so that you are able to sustain the fire of God in your life. Must be intentional. Just like we make going to the gym, if we want to be healthy, intentional, we set aside time. We schedule that in. Most of us. Some of us, we schedule it in, we still don't do it. That's okay. We schedule it in. Why? Because it's important. It's a priority. We schedule in a skincare process of 1 hour in the morning. We schedule in certain things that are important to us. In the same way, cultivating the fire of God and the hunger and the longing for God, the relationship with the Father must also be incorporated into our day to day. For me, I've set my watch that every hour on the hour, it would buzz. It would give me it would alarm. It would give me an alert. And I have made it a point where every time my watch buzzes and I see it's the top of the hour, I would just take a moment. It doesn't have to be long, but I would take a moment and realign my heart to make sure I am connected with Him. I bring Him to mind. I place myself before my Father so that I am with Him in the things that I need to do, the places I need to go, and the people I need to meet. And every hour, my watch would go off, and that would be my reminder, let me reconnect. Why? Because it's a priority. I could be going on with many other things, but when that buzzer goes off, I'm reconnecting for that moment. Just practical ways to make sure that we are growing in our love for God. Number 2, be a recipient. 1 John 3:1 says, see how much our Father loves us. He calls us His children, and that is what we are. 1 John 4:19, we love Him because He first loved us. We align ourselves that we may receive. Because we can only give out what you have received. If we try to give out without first receiving, we're doing it out of obligation and out of religious duty. And you can do that for a time until you eventually run dry and become resentful. Because you feel like you're giving all your effort to connect with God, doing what you can on your own. But yet, what we're taught in Scripture is that we love because He first loved us. Our primary role is to be with Him and to receive from Him the truths that He speaks into our very heart of our identity, of His love for us. And out of that, we are able to reciprocate and give back to God and able to love Him in return. Be intentional. Be a recipient. And lastly, be obedient. John 15:9-10 says, I have loved you even as the Father has loved me. And then He commands them, remain in my love. When you obey, He tells them what, and then He tells them how. When you obey my commandments, you remain in my love. Just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in His love. To remain in the love of God is to obey the words of God. That's why Jesus is the way I'm able to sustain this relationship, this unhindered communication line with the Father is because I am obedient to Him. Tony Evans says this in his commentary, love for Jesus results in obedience, and obedience produces a deeper relationship with Him. Obedience leads to unbroken fellowship with the Father. Now, I'm not saying that we'll never sin, we'll never make a mistake. I'm not saying that at all. But that's where repentance is for. As far as our heart is concerned, we desire to be obedient in all the things that He has told us about, that He is talking to us about. And as we do that, we are able to remain in the love of God.